Hello, my name is Peter Hofschroer. Today is Sunday, the 11th of November 2018, the centenary of the end of the First World War, a war that was supposed to stop tyranny spreading across Europe. Sadly, it didn't. I'm giving this statement from the Sigmund Freud Clinic in Graz, Austria. Graz was the location of the SS School of Psychiatry in the Third Reich, so it makes an appropriate place for me to be. I've been held here unlawfully for a year now and expect to remain here the rest of my life. The so-called crime that led me to being deported from the UK and put here was to attempt to protect my now 89-year-old mother from serious organised crime. A case known as the abuse of Grandma B is well known and is sadly one of the tens of thousands of similar stories of the asset stripping of vulnerable people undertaken by judges, police, social workers and lawyers acting through what in the UK is laughably known as a court of protection. My mother, Barbara Hofschroer, that is Grandma B as she has become known, is currently being held prisoner and largely incommunicado in Haxby Hall Care Home in York after having been brutally kidnapped in May 2012 in her refuge in Germany by a criminal gang consisting of German police, British police, including British military police, and York social workers. This violent raid was led by Grandma B's firstborn, Robert Hofschroer, my older brother, in person. He is sadly her main abuser and is employed by York Social Services. Robert started life as a loving child, but has now become a serious criminal involved in frauds, asset stripping, and other serious crimes. He is closely associated with leading Yorkshire Conservative politician Jane Kenyon, Kenyon. She was exposed on the Real Whitby website and elsewhere as a serial fraudster who obtained public office by deception. She remains the string puller in North Yorkshire, acting behind the scenes. Articles in Real Whitby revealed she had a close relationship with serial child abuser Jimmy Savile, a known Satanist, and took part in ritual alfresco sexual activities involving him and other prominent people. Savile, as is commonly known, was only interested sexually in children. In her role as chair of North Yorkshire Police Authority, Kenyon blocked all attempts to have my brother Robert charged with the numerous criminal offences he has committed. Kenyon also initiated an unlawful civil action against myself and other journalists for alleged harassment for exposing police corruption. The other plaintiffs included Robert, his family, a former social worker, and senior police officers. All are believed to be part of an organised child abuse ring involved in ritual sexual abuse. Robert is also associated with a lady currently serving a long jail sentence for the ritual murder of a complete stranger at midnight on Halloween. The details of this story, which was covered in the mainstream press, can be found on the Grandma B blog. All Grandma B ever wanted was to spend the remaining years of her life living in peace and safety in her own home, in my care. However, Robert and his associates had different plans. They wanted to strip her of her assets and to destroy her life. Grandma B, for background information, spent many years working as a teacher of the deaf. She was totally devoted to her children, gave up her holidays to take them on trips and journeys and to help them integrate into the hearing world, was known as the Mother Teresa of the deaf world, a strong force for good, which is why I suspect these people have targeted her. After poor old Grandma B was kidnapped in Germany in May 2012, she was brought back to the UK against her will and placed at the tender mercies of York Social Services in the middle of Jimmy Savile country in North Yorkshire. She was crippled through willful neglect and has been denied physiotherapy since a hip replacement operation. Furthermore, she has been defrauded of her house, which has now been fraudulently sold, with Robert pocketing the money, and has had all her belongings and money stolen. She continues to be the subject of sustained abuse, particularly at the hands of Jane Richardson of York Social Services. And anybody having any further information on Jane Richardson's activities is asked to contact me. When I returned to York to try to rescue my mother, I was ambushed by men in dark suits and handed over to North Yorkshire Police. Since then, I've been held in custody in England and Austria, and I'm now being held in a psychiatric institution in Graz, Austria, the Sigmund Freud Clinic, where I've been ordered to be detained for life, despite the fact that I'm demonstrably perfectly sane, as confirmed by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Elizabeth Gethins. That's Gethins. My supporters and human rights organisations have been fighting hard to free me, and I'm very grateful for that help. The hospital in which I'm being held is currently subject to a public inquiry that is investigating allegations of systematic abuse of patients by staff in the geriatric ward. This systematic abuse is taking place not just in the geriatric ward. Senior staff in this hospital, including the man whose report led me to be in section for life without ever having examined me, University Professor Dr. Manfred Welzel, is suspected of being part of an organised ring undertaking the ritual sexual abuse of children, including possibly patients in this hospital. An isolated farmhouse in the village of Stiwol, that's Stiwol, is one of the suspected locations. That link, the Satanist abuse of children, connects the events in Jimmy Sour country in North Yorkshire to what is happening here in Graz, Austria. The criminal abuse of psychiatry has been taking place for as long as there has been psychiatry. The most common reasons for such abuse include silencing irritating critics and getting people out of the way so their assets can be plundered. Both apply in my case. The Austrian authorities have a long history of such activity, starting in the days of Sigmund Freud, reaching particularly unpleasant depths during the Third Reich and continuing in not quite so blatant forms since. In March 2018, an exhibition opened in Vienna with the theme of psychiatry, an industry of death. In this exhibition, the case of Austrian Nazi psychiatrist Dr. Heinrich Gross was raised. Despite a history of murdering his patients, Gross escaped prosecution and continued to act as a court expert witness until 1997. Sadly, such abuse of psychiatry by court expert witnesses did not end there. Gross's shoes appear to have been filled by Welzel. Welzel is well known to human rights activists in Austria and elsewhere. The unconfirmed story is that in the shilling days, that is when the shilling was the currency here in Austria, that is before the euro was introduced, Welzel was charged with tax evasion but escaped prosecution by agreeing with the judiciary to fake diagnoses when required. There are also rumours of dodgy business dealings, frauds and fake bankruptcies. Welzel is certainly well known for the sheer quantity of reports he produces for the courts, several hundred a year, many of which are generated without the patient, or rather the victim, having been examined. One human rights organisation known as, in short as SIM, S-I-M, which is an abbreviation for Selbstinteressenvertretung zum Maßnahmenvollzug. It represents people sectioned into psychiatric institutions. SIM has collected a substantial amount of evidence of wrongdoing by Welzel. As well as being the preferred court expert witness in Graz, Welzel works at the Sigmund Freud Clinic, where I'm being held in a senior position and also teaches at the University of Graz. This places him in a position where he can select who gets to study psychiatry, who graduates, who gets a job in psychiatry and whose career progresses. This allows Welzel to ensure that only like-minded people play any role in psychiatry in Graz, which is, as we know, the location of the SS School of Psychiatry in the Third Reich. It appears that Welzel is playing a leading role in the criminal misuse of psychiatry here and is a linchpin in a criminal organisation that is involved in unlawful asset stripping and silencing whistleblowers and possibly child abuse. Welzel has evaded answering questions from the press on the Stiwol case and has ignored my questions on this in a personal meeting. My conflict with the Austrian authorities started at the beginning of 2011. In January 2011, an attempt was made by Austrian police acting on behalf of North Yorkshire Police to arrest me for allegedly kidnapping my mother, for whom I've been full-time carer since early 2009. This attempt failed due to lack of evidence. Then in June 2011, I commenced a civil action in the Austrian courts against certain of my accusers in Britain. As the judge, Dr. Martin Steffula, that's S-T-E-F-U-L-A, was so blatantly partial, I had the civil action stayed pending development. I knew that Lord McGuinness was kindly taking up the case at high levels in the British government and was anticipating this would result in a favourable outcome. In May 2012, Lord McGuinness made certain statements in the British Parliament which the Austrian courts could not ignore, as this was important, irrefutable evidence in my civil proceedings. The judge, Steffula, responded to my application to reopen the case by declaring me to lack mental capacity, so preventing me from continuing the litigation. Under Austrian law, a judge may determine that a person lacks mental capacity on the basis of his own opinion, and then sets a process in way that confirms his opinion. Steffula is not likely of acting on his own initiative here. Available correspondence and documentary evidence shows that my brother Robert is directing this case internationally in collaboration with North Yorkshire Police, who, as we know, protected Jimmy Savile for decades. Robert's son, Martin Hofschroer, coordinates dealings in Austria with a local lawyer, a certain Dr. Reinhard Togel, who then sourced a judge willing to act corruptly to get me out of the way so that the property frauds in the UK and Austria could be closed off. The judge in this case, I've mentioned his name before, Steffula, then used the services of Walzel, as he is the main court-appointed expert witness who reliably fakes diagnoses to order. Sensibly, I googled Walzel's name and established he has a long history of faking diagnoses at the request of the courts, so I evaded being examined by him by not being available at the times he wanted to visit me. Instead, the court ordered a psychologist to examine me. However, the psychologist attempted to visit me without an appointment, so I sent him away. Meanwhile, I went through all the official appeal options available to me, which the courts rejected on ever more dubious grounds. Finally, in September 2013, the courts ordered I be detained in a mental home for life without a psychiatrist having examined me here in Austria. I then left Austria, taking my mother with me. As I could not be subjected to any legal requirement to return to Austria to be confined in a mental home, the Austrian police then fabricated a series of false allegations against me and used them to issue a European arrest warrant. On the basis of this warrant, I was extradited from the UK to Austria in July 2017. While in the UK, my solicitors arranged for me to undergo a psychiatric examination, which confirmed what is obvious to anybody that knows me, sees me, or has any dealings with me, that I have no mental health issues. When I returned to Austria, the courts ordered Walzel to examine me, but I again refused. I referred the courts to the UK report, which the courts refused to consider. Instead, the judge issued a document outlining what he wanted to hear about my mental health. This was then sent to the state prosecutor, who changed the head and tail before forwarding it to Walzel, who then changed the head and tail again. This bogus report was then returned to the court, a feat easily and rapidly accomplished with standard word processing software. This explains how Walzel can produce hundreds of expert reports every year without ever examining the patient. The court ordered that I be detained in a psychiatric institution for special treatment. They actually use the word in German Sonderbehandlung, which is what the Nazis used to describe how they treated Jews and other people they didn't like. Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, to make me confess to having committed crimes I had not. Failing that, I'm to be detained for life. All that was missing from the court order was use of the term final solution. My house in Austria can only be sold when I'm dead. Only then do the judges involved in this case get their share of the proceeds of this crime. They now have both the motive and the opportunity. I was transferred to the Sigmund Freud Clinic in Graz from prison in November 2017. Doctors here refused to read and consider the psychiatrist's report commissioned by the English courts, refused to provide medication for my physical ailments, and insisted I take antipsychotic medication, which have resulted in permanent brain damage. When I refused to do so, the doctors withheld treatment for a chronic physical condition. This continued until outside pressure forced them to change their minds on both issues. Since being in the Sigmund Freud clinic, threats have been made to give me the liquid kosh. One night, male nurses dragged me out of my bed, strapped me down and threatened to inject me. Again, outside pressure forced the doctors here to change their mind. Then one day, police officers came along with the intention of getting a sample of my DNA and wet copies of my fingerprints. When I refused to cooperate, a male nurse screamed threats at me. Finally, one of the police officers assaulted me and obtained a small sample of my DNA. A doctor hovered in the background, evidently hoping for an opportunity to administer the liquid kosh. All this effort was unnecessary to obtain my DNA and fingerprints, as the Austrian police have access to a database that provides this information, which North Yorkshire Police had already obtained. So what was going on here? Wet samples were needed to plant on the 46 videos Austrian police had placed in my house here. When the case came to court, my fingerprints had not been found on any of the videos, while there were only minimal traces of DNA on 4 of them. That was all the DNA the Austrian police had been able to obtain from me, thanks to my failure to cooperate with them. My supporters then kindly raised a substantial sum of money, and Mum and I are both very grateful for that, and they did this through crowdfunding. Part of this was spent on obtaining an expert assessment of the psychiatric reports faked by Welzel. The Austrian forensic psychologists who examined them showed them to be worthless, as they were full of errors, contradictory and unlawful. Neither the courts nor the clinic took any notice of this. My appeal was rejected on very dubious grounds, but work is continuing on having my conviction and sectioning overturned. My supporters have a number of plans of how to take the matter further, and these, I'm sure, will be announced in due course. My thanks go to the many people who have supported poor old Mum and I for so many years now, to those who have been and still are working hard for our liberty, to the many people who generously donated to our fighting fund, and to all the listeners to this broadcast. Thank you to you all.